I'm reviewing these first couple of weeks or times together because these are so foundational for everything else. The rest of Scripture will build on these two things, these two times that we've had. So if we can get this in our heads, other things will make sense. And even as we look to Christmas, it'll help make sense as well. And we talked about at the beginning the image of God. You work with people, and some of you work with kind of creational things, and all that goes back to the first couple of chapters in Genesis, where God creates the world. It's very good at the end of that time, but he repeats 6 times it's good, and then very good once he creates humans. And so the whole creation is this wonderful intermingling of all these creatures within which he has placed humans. And what you find in chapter 1 is the unique part of humans and also what they share. So with the rest of creation. So we've talked about this, where to make the image of God is that we have uncomparable worth. There's no other creature that is made like we are. In chapter 2, it'll use the idea of shaping us from the ground. So it's like the idea of a potter molding us. In chapter 1, it's more of the spoken, but here in chapter 2, it would be where God is actually molding humans. So there's this worth, this uniqueness that we have, but also the idea that we have the potential to rule and subdue the earth. Now that tells us the fact that it needs to be subdued, that God's work is not done, even at the end of creation, that he is inviting us to continue his rule, but to subdue it. There's more work to be done. He's inviting us to become part of his work. But we do this under him, and this is where things go desperately wrong in chapter 3. So we have our worth, we have our potential, we have our calling to join with him and to continue his work. I mean, that's the ideal world. But you also see that the idea of human worth is related to the fact that we rule. And we should rule like God rules. Even as we subdue the animals and other things, we should do this as God does in chapter 1. I mean, that's the image that he gives us. Now, because all of us work with people, and some of the most unlovely people in the world's eyes, we've got to keep coming back to the idea of who they really are and what we're trying to point them toward and what we're trying to convince them of in terms of how much worth they have and all the potential they have once they get right with God and become part of a bigger community. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But we also have the fall, you see. And so with the fall, if we are created in the image of God, it's interesting that the temptation is in chapter 3, verse 5, the serpent will tell the woman that what God is afraid of is that we will be like him, you see. And this is, the temptation is to be like God, and he tells the woman that this is what God is a bit worried about. And it's just a twisted thing because we are like God. I mean, the fact that we are in his image tells us that we are like God at some level. The thing is how do we act all of this out? Now, once humans take on the role of God in a fallen world, this is where we get, as we see in the narratives very quickly in chapter 4, we get cruelty, we get violence. Cain kills Abel. What we're seeing from the very beginning, and you would see this in your work on the street or whatever ministry you're in, issues of power differentials are going on right from the beginning. Who controls who and who controls what? These are the power differentials that are kicked in with the fall. And the thing is that when humans take over this power grid, if I can call it that, they'll do it for their own personal gain and for their own control. And the way humans do this is that we eliminate the rival, you see. We subjugate the person who might take our place, or we feel threatened. And this is what humans will do. We eliminate, we segregate, we dominate. These are the ways that humans will act out being God. We begin to make separations. We begin to say one race is better than another race. One social class or economic class is better than another class. One country is better than another country. What you're seeing in all of these things is Genesis 3 acting itself out in our world. So once we begin to understand that our fundamental problem is that even as we are like God in all the proper senses of the word, see, the temptation is to be like God without God, or to be like God in place of God. The idea of justice and mercy are central to the person of God himself. And so if we're not involved or committed to these things, we're actually not functioning as the image of God. If God has these as central to his person, to be made the image of God means that we will act on these things and incarnate these things and embrace these things because we are in his image. And so you begin to reframe all of these discussions as kind of universal to the people of God and not just to certain people who have a certain calling. Now, what we talked about before as well is the idea in Genesis 2, when God tells them in the garden that if they eat of this tree, they will surely die. We talked about this. And the interesting thing in the narrative is that nobody dies. In chapter 3, when this actually happens, nobody dies. It's a kind of an ironic chapter, because the temptation to be like God, well, we are like God in the proper sense of the word. Of course, this gets perverted. You shall surely die. Nobody dies. In fact, when the man names the woman, he calls her Eve, which is a word play in the Hebrew on life. And so she's actually the giver of life. But what about the death? At the end of chapter 3, there is no death. They're excluded from the garden. So there's, the New Testament might call it spiritual death, but the Old Testament hasn't used that kind of vocabulary. The Old Testament sees it as separation from God, exclusion from his presence, you see. So the death actually comes in chapter 4 when Cain kills Abel. And so they're seeing it in very literal, physical terms. With the fall comes human death by the hands of humans. Okay? We kill each other. And this goes back to the idea of domination. Apparently in chapter 4 with Cain, there's jealousy toward Abel. And so what you do is you just eliminate your brother. Okay, we'll come back to another part of that passage, which is fundamental to our understanding. When you get later on in chapter 4, Cain is afraid to be sent wandering because people will find him and they will kill him. He actually says this. And at the end of chapter 4, he talks, Lamech just is boasting about how many men he can kill. Then you get to chapter 5 and you get that refrain, and he died and he died and he died. So death, not by violence, but death by old age. So this is the context then for what we're going to talk about, which is death and failure. Failure because we have these examples of light, right? You have Seth, you have Enoch, and you have Noah, and Noah, the great hope, right, is going to overturn, this is in 529, overturn all the curse. But the last thing we see of Noah is he's drunk and passed out in his tent. So in the midst of that failure, what we do, or what we see, is God creating a people. Now you can see on your screen that I said in context. Okay, part of that context is the death and failure. And this is going to be important for our ministries. These individuals are not enough. So what God will do is he'll create a people. Okay, that's an important thing, you see. So it's not just these individuals, who can be very good, even though they fail. And Noah is the prime example of that. But the idea is that he's going to create a people for this. And that gets back to what we were talking about in terms of mission. Now, what we looked at also in Genesis 12 is that when you go to Genesis 12, 1-3, it's playing with the words of earlier passages. See, in Genesis 11, where the idea is to build a tower that reaches to the heavens, this is the climax of human arrogance, Genesis 3:5 again, right? We're going to be like God and be where God is. We're going to make a name for ourselves. That's what they say in chapter 11. Chapter 12, see, I will make your name great. There's the difference. Instead of greatness based on our arrogance, it's greatness coming in mission. I will make you a great people, you see. So the idea of being fruitful and multiplying, which is for all humans, now God will especially focus on multiplying a particular people. So it's the upside down kingdom, you see, that we hear so much about when we come into Genesis 12, 1-3. And then you get the idea as well of being a blessing to all the nations or clans or families, depending on your English version of the world. And that's a wordplay back in the chapter 10, where all the nations of the world, which are born at Babel, are going to be the focus of our blessing. All the nations who rebel against God, chapter 10, born in chapter 11, these are the targets of our mission. Okay, so the very human race that has rebelled against God as a unit, right, now become the focus of the blessing of God. And this is important to understand mission as well. God is committed to redeeming a rebellious and fallen world. And he does this through his people. And this is the idea of being a blessing. And what we talked about last time, and Christine, I'll stop in just a moment, see if anyone has any questions. But what we find, we saw last time, is that the blessing, if you work it through Genesis, let Genesis define its own terms. What you find in chapter 1, where God blesses things, it's about life and creation and children. And as you read the book of Genesis, it's about flocks, sheep, Jacob working for Laban, right? All these flocks keep multiplying and finding water when no one else can find water. And all of these things, food, you see, all of these things are part of the blessing of God. But what you also find is that the blessing, chapter 2, verses 1-3, is that he will bless the Sabbath. And now you're seeing that there is a spiritual dimension to blessing. What you find with Genesis 12, and this is another reason why it's so fundamental, the very reason for our existence is mission. We are created for the world. Okay, that's the only reason he'll call Abram, is how to reach the world. I mean, so we are created as a people to serve and bless the world. That's why we're here. So it's not we're just supposed to get in our holy huddles and all these kinds of things that might have its place, and we don't come to faith just for our own benefit. That'll have its place. Ultimately, though, we come for mission. And even those whom we serve, eventually, if we can get them doing mission, see, now we've actually given them the privilege of participating in this thing that goes back to the very beginning. And I was just thinking, what does self-care mean in these narratives of Genesis? And this idea, I thought, self-care is in these. You don't have retreats in Genesis, okay? You'll have prayer and things like this, sacrifices. But the idea of learning how to be faithful in the midst of these things is how they live out the life that God has given them. And the self-care becomes learning how to be faithful in the midst of a lot of tragedy. Because, and this echoes what you were asking, life is tragic. Oh my gosh, it's tragic. It's so many levels. And so it's how to be faithful in a world of tragedy and to rejoice when we can and when God gives us good things. But, life is full of tragedy. And so what we find in Genesis is hunger. Genesis 12, they receive the promise and they go into the land, all's good, and then there's a famine in the land. And so they're hungry, and that's when they begin to migrate to Egypt. In Genesis 26, they're looking for water. It's kind of, again, if I can use the example of Ukraine again, because it's at hand. But now as they move into winter, just being cold, you see, not being able to cook your food and sanitation, all these things, the human things. And so what you see is these people are being thrust into real life, and in the midst of all of this, they're called to be faithful and to trust God. And it doesn't mean that there is no tragedy. It means that you learn to walk faithfully through life with Him. And that's key. And sometimes they do well, and sometimes they fail. Self-preservation. In chapter 12, we see Sarai lying at the border. I'm his sister, not his wife, and she's willing to put her body at risk sexually so that the rest of them can eat. Horrendous kind of decision that she makes. Her husband isn't very helpful on this because he's kind of self-serving. But again, these extremes, desperate measures that are part of the life that we have to live. Finding a home in chapter 13, Abram and Lot, you see, which way are you going to go on this thing? And Abram is willing to step back and let Lot choose. He chooses poorly. But finding a place to live, a place to dig your roots. This is a very human kind of thing. War. In chapter 14, Abram will rescue Lot. In chapter 34, it's an ugly scene. And this is where it's not self-defense at all. In chapter 14, you have what we think is the rape of Dinah. And then so the brothers want revenge. And so very human instinct. And so they tell the men of Shechem that if they circumcise themselves, this can all work out. Well, basically, when they circumcise themselves, they're incapacitated, which means they can't defend themselves. And this family of God supposedly will kill them in the most perverse way you can imagine, because they do this by exploiting the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. So war, this is tragic, it's awful, but this is the life that they're living. Rivalries. Chapter 16 and 21, it's Sarah and Hagar. These two women, rivalries because of children. Sarah is jealous of her handmaid who has a son. And then, it gets so bad that, she tells Abraham to send her away. This is very human. These women, rivals in the household of Abraham. In 27, the Jacob and Esau story, right? Where the rivalry for the blessing of the father and the mother gets involved. And Jacob has to flee. Chapter 33, he comes back. And he's afraid of what Esau will do to him. The rivalry among the brothers. And then, of course, in 37, this is where Joseph's brothers hate him because the father is very open about his favorite, and they want to kill him. And eventually they get talked out of it, but they sell him away. So again, this is the reality of the ugliness of even the people of God. And there's death. Chapter 23, Sarah dies. Chapter 25, Abram dies, and Jacob will die, and then Joseph will die in chapter 50. So what you're finding, besides the killing that we saw in chapter 34, they're living death and having to bury their own. And unlike today, where we farm this out to professionals, in the ancient world, you would take care of the bodies of your dead. And oftentimes, sometimes in the ancient world, they bury you under the floor of the house. And so the body is in the home. It's a very small place. If you've ever been in Israel, you see how small these places are. They're surrounded by death. And then injustice. This is where Joseph is in jail. He's a very honest man and hardworking and trustworthy, but Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. He runs away. Well, who are the Egyptian authorities going to believe? Are they going to believe the foreigner? Or are they going to believe the Egyptian woman? Well, they believe the Egyptian woman, and he's the one who goes to jail. So what you're finding in this book is all of the ugliness and the tragedies, some self-inflicted, some that come against them, and some just very human. They die. And this is the world in which, I would have to wonder, what would self-care look like in the book of Genesis? And it's learning how to be faithful and to trust him. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention, and we'll see this as we go through, our various Mondays, is I'm trying, as you can tell, hopefully, I'm trying to get us away from cherry picking verses. I'm trying to get us to get a sense of narratives, because if we can talk about mission and what God wants in the midst of this kind of world, which is our world, then it makes sense. Then it's not pie in the sky. Then it's not just kind of, oh, this is really great, hallelujah, and we go on and sing some songs. I mean, no, this is the world in which they live, and this is the world in which they are called to mission, and this is the world in which they have success and utter failure, and where they sin and they bless. This is the nitty-gritty of mission. And I would say this is probably the experience of everyone that's on this call, is that it's not all success. And you're going to sin. You are. The question is what, how bad, and how faithful you are in the midst of all of the rivalry, all of the tragedy, all of the death and dying. We stay faithful to the mission. And the thing that we need to realize is that God stays faithful to the mission. God stays faithful to the mission. What you're seeing is the multiple dimensions of human depravity and human suffering. And the redemption of God has to be as broad as what you see. God's redemption has to respond to every one of these dimensions. This is why we use the idea of kingdom. Okay, because if it cannot respond to the breadth of all of this, it cannot be hope. Okay, and I'll end with hope this evening. And Christine, let me go on. So this is a nice segue to God and the world. And I just want to mention some things. Okay, the last slide was a depressing one. But what we find throughout Genesis is that God sees and hears. In 4:10, it's the blood of Abel that's crying to heaven. God hears this, you see, and he responds. 16:13, Hagar in the wilderness. And she will say, God, the God who sees me. Okay. In chapter 18, verse 20, it's the Sodom and Gomorrah with the visitors to Abraham. And the sin of Sodom is risen to the heavens. You see, so God is cognizant of this, both of the suffering and of the sin. Okay? And so God is actually engaged in this. Okay? He's watching it, he's seeing it. And in each of these cases, he responds to it. And of course, this will be the segue to Exodus chapter 2, where he hears the groaning of his people. And this is the kind of good news, that God hears our groaning. God sees the violence and the blood from the ground. You see, God hears the cries of the blood of Abel. You see, this is important for the kind of work that we do, that God hears it and he sees it and he responds to it. And he is faithful to his people and to his promises. Now, here's the thing. This is why putting mission in terms of corporate mission and not only individual mission is important. He's faithful to things that are bigger than us. Okay. So he's faithful to us as individual believers, but there's something bigger going on. He's faithful to his people. So whatever we're doing is part of something bigger that we may not even know what's going on, but we're part of a bigger puzzle and a bigger movement. And that's why sometimes we will see the faithful things of God in the immediate, but sometimes it's for the long term. So the timetables and the vision of what we're experiencing is going to be very different. It's going to be, going at all these different angles in multiple ways that we can't even understand. But this is part of this bigger thing that God is being faithful to, the thing being his people and his timetable and his mission, even as he's being faithful to us as individuals as we go through this. Okay. And I think that's important too. That, for instance, when we read the Joseph story, well, it's very unfair what happens to him. I mean, his brothers sell him off. He's put into a jail. I mean, he comes out, but at the end of the story, if you remember, his brothers are wondering why he doesn't kill them out of revenge. And he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Okay, what he's telling you is the long term. Years have gone by. And because of who he is and where he is, he now is able to save from hunger the entire clan. See? So it's corporate. Even it's about his life, right, and his brother's life. There's a corporateness, and out of Egypt now will be birthed the people of God 400 years later. I mean, so what you're seeing is all of these dimensions going on simultaneously, that even as Joseph is the Joseph story is part of the story of the people of God, and the story of the people of God is part of the story of humanity. And it's all interwoven. The other thing, I say God engages, and maybe there's a better verb for it. But in chapter 18, verses 22 and 32, 232, these are Abraham is arguing with God. God says, I'm going to destroy the evil cities down there. And he says, well, what if I find, 50 people who are good, or 45 and 40 and 30? And he gets down to 10. And God says, well, I'm happy to do that. But what you're seeing is that it's okay to argue with God about issues of God's just dealings or not. And I think that's important. It's like what I was saying earlier about Job. It's okay to argue with God about these things. And the biblical character is kind of giving us permission to do this. Okay? This is part of God's engagement with the world. But God is also faithful in his judgments, not only in his blessing. And there's a couple of verses, and let me read them, and this is the NIV. But the last line of verse 25 says this: will not the judge of all the earth do right? Okay, that's the question. So for God to do justice, I mean, will not the judge of all the earth do justice? But look at what he says in verse 19. When the angels is talking, or men is talking to Abraham, he says, for I have chosen him, meaning Abraham, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So what you have is, will not the judge of all the earth do right? He has chosen him to do what is right and just. You see, so there again, you're seeing the very person of God interconnected with the call of his people. And I've chosen him, you see, and his descendants, you see. So this is, again, the mission of God, reflecting the character of God. And now the image of God is not only, you and me, the image of God now should be reflected in his people. And when we get to the law, we'll work out how this was supposed to have happened in the ancient world. Now my time is kind of running out, so what I thought I'd do is mention this and see if there's any other questions. But so we're getting into Christmas time, right? So I thought I'd end with hope. And a lot of times what happens, and I understand it, people will go to the proto-evangelium is what it's called, Genesis 3:15, about the seed of the woman, and the idea that the seed of the woman eventually will be Jesus. Okay, and I think that's true. So I'm not okay. But if you're a reader of Genesis, there is no such person as a Jesus yet. Right? You have no idea where this story is going. Actually, you know that sometime, evil will be defeated. But this is what I would say if I were just staying in Genesis. Okay. What the Old Testament is setting you up for, and this is where I think evangelicals miss something very important. They look for predictions of Jesus in the Old Testament. Okay, I get that. But what we find, which I think is helpful for issues of justice, you find longing for a different world, you see. And this is why eventually, as we move through the Old Testament, the longing for a Messiah to come. And so what Genesis begins to do with this imperfect people in this tragic world in which they live is to set up the longing for a different world, the longing for different kinds of people, the longing that things will be different, you see. And this will set up the coming of Messiah. Now, one of the things we celebrate at Christmas time is that Messiah has actually come. But what I want us to appreciate is what you find in the Old Testament and even in Genesis is the longing that the injustice would end. See, the longing for the suffering to finish, see, and seeing these glimpses of light in their stories, in the movement of God, but it's still unfulfilled. And so this to me adds teeth to the Christmas story. Instead of just being predictions and we celebrate the coming of Jesus and we don't really know what that means, but it's a very nice kind of thing, right? The coming of Jesus, and we'll see this later on in other studies, is the coming of Messiah. And the Messiah is one who will come and set everything right, you see. And this is what we long for in the Old Testament. And so it's setting up the coming of Jesus in ways that are intimately integrated into issues of mercy and compassion and justice and shalom, because it's not here.